By popular demand, we're going to talk about Purim. And if you have either a Megillus Esther or the pages that David was kind enough to circulate on email, the entire shir today will be built on two psukim. So if you can't see these two psukim in front of your eyes, you might as well shut down now, because the whole shir is built on two psukim. So either you get yourself a Megillah and you see the two psukim, or you open up the email. It's one of those two. Otherwise, it's came out a waste of time, because I'm going to keep referring to these two psukim, and we're going to be medayik in these two psukim. So you're not going to follow my point here. I'm going to try to build a whole thesis based on a diuk in the first pasuk and a diuk in the second pasuk. We're in the 9th chapter of Megillas Esther. And keep in mind that Megillas Esther is part of Tanakh. It was written by Ruach HaKodesh. And we could be medayik and read it meticulously, just like we would read any part of the Torah meticulously. Now, the background is that after the great Hatzalah, the Yeshua of Purim, Mordechai sends word to the people, and he hopes that they'll accept upon themselves the holiday of Purim. And in two psukim, which are right near each other, Pasuk Yutes and Pasuk Chavtes, so basically Pasuk Yutes and Pasuk Chav Beis, I meant to say, basically they're three psukim apart. The Torah, the Tanakh, will record what exactly the Jewish people were willing to accept and what they weren't willing to accept. And the Gemara is going to analyze the first pasuk in one sugya and the second in another sugya. And today we're going to see that the Turi Even, who was the Shagas Aryeh, saw a contradiction here between the two drashos and the interpretations of Chazal, these two psukim. We're going to try to reconcile that contradiction. So let's go one at a time. Pasuk Yud Tes. Alkein haYehudim haPrazim haYoshvim b'Arei haPrazos. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about unwalled cities that are exposed to great danger. Osim es yom arbasa l'chodesh hadar. They accepted the 14th of Adar. And what did they accept? So the Tanakh gives four terms, four terminology. Number one, Simcha. Number two, Mishteh. Number three, Yom Tov. And finally, number four, Mishloach Manos Ish L'Reu. The Gemara is going to analyze this on Daf Hey Amid Beis in Masechta Megillah in the name of Rav Yosef. And the Gemara says the following: Tani Rav Yosef, Simcha u'Mishteh v'Yom Tov. Notice that he leaves out Mishloach Manos. We're going to have a discussion about that in Mitzvah Hashem, but three terms he's darshaning: Simcha, Mishteh, v'Yom Tov. Simcha melamed shasurim behesped. So if they take the dead out to bury, there's no hesped based on the term simcha. And we're talking again about the 14th of Adar. It's a day of simcha, and hesped is antithetical to simcha. The purpose of hesped is to bring a person to a state of tsar to a state of avelus, of grief and mourning. That's antithetical to a day of simcha. Simcha and avelus don't match. They cannot coexist. Mishteh, melamed shasurim v'tainis. No fasting on Purim. On the 14th of Adar, there's no fasting because fasting is antithetical to Mishteh. Mishteh is rejoicing, eating, drinking, merrymaking. That's not. You can't integrate that into a solemn day of fast. So far we have Simcha, which generates an Easter Hesped. We have Mishteh that generates an Easter Titus. And finally, the third description of the day of Purim is Yom Tov. Melamed shasurim b'asiyas melocha. In the original plan, the scheme that Mordechai wanted for Purim, it would be a day of Easter Melacha. That's the sugya of Rav Yosef on Daf Hey. The Gemara later on says that the people did not accept Easter Melacha. But keep in mind the following positive and negative descriptions of Pasuk Yutes. Positive mentions Yontif. Negative, it does not mention Yemei Purim. Now we fast forward to Pasuk Chaf Beis. And there the Pasuk says about this day that was transformed from Yagon to Simcha, from Avel to Yom Tov. And then it says, without describing the holiday and the celebration, it describes the day itself. The day itself, together with apparently the 15th of Adar, Yemei Mishteh v'Simcha u'Mishloach Manos. We have here again a repetition of Mishteh v'Simcha, but in the reverse order. The sequence back in Pasuk Yutes was Simcha first and Mishteh second. And if the sequence is significant, it would seem that Simcha is really primary, and it generates Mishteh as a sort of spin-off. But in Pasuk Chaf Beis, it starts with Mishteh, and then it goes to Simcha, as if Mishteh is primary, and Simcha is sort of a spin-off. But the most important two things about Pasuk Chaf Beis, one in the negative and the other in the positive. In the negative, the description of the day in terms of how we celebrate the day omits the Yom Tov. The positive is that it adds a description of these days as Yemei, etc. And Rava points out that whenever it says Yom, we have to derive Yom v'lo Laila. Hence, says Rava, in Megillah Daf Zayin Amud Beis, Seudas Purim she'achla b'layla. If on the night of the 14th you eat your Seudas Purim, in many yeshivas, I'll tell you off the bat, they celebrated the night of the 14th with all the hupla. Lo yotze yedei chovasa. He has not fulfilled his obligation. My taima, Yemei Mishteh v'Simcha ksiv, Yomim v'lo leilos. And now we're ready for the kasha of the Turei Even, otherwise known as the Shagas Aryeh. He says the following. If we assume the drasha of Rava on Daf Zayin, the basis of which Rava comes to the conclusion that if you eat your Seudas Purim at night, you're not fulfilling your obligation because Yomim v'lo Lailos, and now apply that to the Iser, Hesped, and Tainis, then we will come to the mistaken conclusion that on the night of Purim, there is no Iser Hesped V'Tainus, meaning that the definition of Yemei Simcha Umishte is Yomim V'Lo. So the Yom itself, as a day of Simcha, says the Tur Even, emerges with daybreak in the morning of the 14th, but does not include, it does not spread its mantle over the night going into Purim, because the Tanakh describes those as Yemei Purim. So therefore we should derive the following conclusions. One conclusion is Rava's conclusion explicitly, that if you eat the Sudas Purim at night, you're not fulfilling. Second conclusion we should derive, there's no Iser Hesped at night, because that's not Yemei Purim. And the third conclusion is there's no Iser Tainus at night, which means what we call a Tainus Shos. You want to go ahead and fast and be Mekabel yourself a 12-hour Tainus at night, you're allowed to do so. Comes along the Tur Even, he says that's not true. We know that that's not true. The Iser Hesped V'Tainus apply even at night. Now, in the light of Rava's drasha of Yemei Purim Yomim V'Lo Leilos, and the conclusion that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Purim at night, so that means that the Simcha and Mishteh of Purim is only during the day and not at night, and that's what we derive from Yemei Purim. Then therefore, when we go back to the original drasha of Rav Yosef, which we saw from Daf Hey, regarding the Iser Hesped and Tainus, then we take the miyut of Yemei Purim, which defines Simcha and Mishteh as Yomim V'Lo Leilos, and we plug it into Pasuk Tes, where again it says that Simcha U'Mishteh, and therefore we come to the conclusion that whatever we derive from Simcha U'Mishteh could only apply during the day. Hence, we would come to the mistaken conclusion that there's no Iser Hesped V'Tainus at night. And that's a mistake. He says, impossible. We know from all the sources and all the Rishonim and all the poskim that there's an Iser Hesped V'Tainus at night. What happened to the drasha of Yemei? Now, leaving the kasha of the Tur Even on the side, you minds might already be working on an answer, but let's go on to another question that's raised by the Tur Even. And this is regarding the Iser Malacha. The Tur Even says that there are two mi'utim here. One mi'ut is from the word Yemei, and that comes to be Mamayit Laila. However, there's an implicit mi'ut with regard to Iser Malacha. Why? Because the Gemara says that Iser Malacha lo kiblu alayhu, that the people of Israel refused to accept upon themselves the Iser Malacha. Comes along the Tur Even and he says, let's piggyback one miyut on top of the other miyut. And the conclusion we should come to is that when they didn't accept upon themselves the Iser Malacha, that's only as far as the day is concerned. But the miyut that excludes Laila means that they may have accepted upon themselves the Iser Malacha B'Laila. And the Tur Even says that's against a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says that if a person was writing a Megillah in order to be Magia, if he wanted to see if there are any mistakes, Chaseros, or he added a couple of letters here and there, Im Kiven Libo Yatza. if he had in mind to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah, because he was Magia B'Peh, then he was Yotze. So the Yerushalmi immediately asks, what do you mean? If he was Magia, then apparently you're allowed to do Malacha on Purim. And maybe what this halacha of Hoya Magia Megillah is all about is to teach you that they didn't accept upon themselves the Isur Malacha. So the Turei Even says, how do you know this? I don't understand the logic and the proof of the Yerushalmi. How do you know that it's mutter to do malacha because lo kibla layhu? Maybe they were makabel on themselves isur malacha, but not by day and only by night. And therefore, let's interpret the halach of Hoya Magia, etc. And he read out loud that we're talking about when he was Magia at night. And as far as the night is concerned, they weren't makabel on themselves because the night is not part of the Yemei Simcha Mishteh. As we saw in Rava's Drosh on Daf Zayin, Yemei Purim v'lo leilos. So if the Laila is being excluded, then it might be that the Laila is being excluded from Isur Malacha. They weren't makabel themselves, Isur Malacha at night. And therefore there was a Heter Malacha at night. So that the Magia, who was doing a malacha of writing a Megillah, he was doing it at night. But as far as the daytime is concerned, which is the real Purim of Mishteh and Simcha, perhaps they were makabel Isur Malacha. How does the Yerushalmi prove that lo kibla layu, by virtue of the halacha of Magia might be talking about a case of at night? And indeed, they never accepted the Isur Malacha at night because the nighttime is not part of the entity of Yemei Simcha u Mishteh, because Yemei Simcha and Mishteh are Yomim v'lo leilos. So just to summarize everything that we've been saying here, and then Joe, you'll take over for me.
No, just clarify. I'm sorry. When would be the Isur Malacha? I just want to clarify.
Then the Isur Malacha would be valid by day because that's by when Purim is.
Okay, but not by
lo kibla alayu, when the guy went ahead and he wrote a Megillah at night, that was at night. Because night was excluded through Yemei. If you remember the drush of Rava that we mentioned from Daf Zayin, that excludes the night, and therefore Achol Suda Balayla lo yotzi de chovaso, and it could be at night, they weren't makabel on themselves the Isur Malacha, because the final conclusion is that the night of Purim is not part of the day of Purim. The day of Purim really emerges with Amud HaShachar, with the break, with what we call a daybreak. But just to summarize, the two questions of the Turei Even are both premised on a combination of miyutim, meaning he sees in the miyut of Yomim v'lo leilos a definition of Simcha and Mishteh, and once we apply that, then we exclude the nighttime from Simcha Mishteh, and therefore we can allow at night for Malacha because that wasn't really part of Purim. They never accepted an Isur Malacha at night. And then we could go ahead and say that the Sudas Purim at night is not valid because the night is not Purim. So we're left with two questions then. Question number one, as we saw earlier, the Turei Even wants to know, how could there be an Isur of Tainus and an Isur of Hesped on the night of Purim? The night of Purim is not part of Yemei Purim. And second question is, maybe in fact there is an Isur Malacha, and they accepted the Isur Malacha, as the Pasuk says, Pasuk Yutes, Yom Tov, but they only accepted the Yom Tov Isur Malacha only by day. But as we said before, Yemei Purim in Pasuk Chav Beis is going to exclude Laila, and therefore Laila there's no Isur Malacha. And when was the person fixing the Megillah? At night. But that doesn't prove a thing about lo kiblu alayu because they were makabel isur malacha. That's the argument of the Turei Even. Before we go on, I want to add a few other questions that were not raised by the Turei Even. One is from the Emek Bracha, and you'll see it on the bottom of your page. The Emek Bracha wants to understand the following. In Yontif, we have halacha of yayin or basar, meaning you could fulfill the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif in one of two ways. You don't have to do both. It's either or, either through drinking yayin or through eating basar. But if you look at the Rambam in Perek Beis Milchus Megillah, Ketzad Chovas Suda Zu, how do you fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha on Purim and eat your Suda? The Rambam says that Yochal Basar, I don't know about chicken, by the way, my wife asked me about chicken, but anyway, Yochal Basar, the Rambam says, and Shose Yayin. A clear-cut response of the Rambam that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Sudas Purim without A plus B. You need both basar and yayin. And yet, with regard to simcha, and the paradigm of simcha is v'samachta b'chagecha on yontif, you could do one or the other, either eat meat or drink wine, and flip a coin. But here in Purim, paradoxically, we are more machmir, and according to the Rambam at least, we need both yayin and basar. Finally, we have the very famous kasha. Well, I shouldn't say finally because I want to add one other kasha, but number 4 on your list, if you're listing the kashas, is the question of the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav says that in Purim we have a strange halacha, chayav inish l'psume b'purai. You have to get intoxicated, whatever that means. There's so many different possibilities, but that doesn't apply on Yontif. So why is it that in the paradigm of Simcha, which is v'samachta b'chagech on Yontif, we don't find chayav anish l'psume b'Yontif ad lo yoda? Why do we find it in Purim? Now on page 2, if you happen to have these pages that were sent, I have another quote here from the Bach, and that's on the bottom of page 2. The Bach, in turn, quotes a Mordechai, who in turn quotes a Rav Yah. The Rav Yah, one of the great Chachmei Ashkenaz, says that just like during the day of Purim, you're required to eat a Suda, so too on the night of Purim, you have to eat a Suda. And the Rav Yah even goes a step further. He seems to indicate, and if we have time, we'll go through it inside, that if you ate the Suda, he calls it a Su'uda Chashuva at night, going into the 14th, then you are Yotzei of Mitzvah. And even if you don't eat a Suda Chashuva during the day of Purim, you could be Yotzei at the night. And you'll see in the literature, the Bach and others attack the Rav Yah, and they say, what are you talking about? There's no Suda of Purim at night. Rava says explicitly that the Suda has to be by day, and he derives from the pasuk Yemei Purim, Yom, and not Laila. So how do we justify this Rav Yah? And finally, I don't know what question we're up to. I think 6. I think we're up to question 6. This is not always my style, to hit you with, bombard you with 6 questions and try to answer them all with one chiddush. But we'll give it a shot. The 6th question is from the Pnei Yoshua. The Pnei Yoshua wants to focus on a kasha that Tosfos asks about a minhag to recite Shechiyanu at night and then a second time during the day. 2 Shechiyanus. How do we justify that? And the Pnei Yoshua says it's fine. I understand it very well. He has no problems with it. And he assumes that the Shechianu by day is on the mitzvah of Megillas Esther, Kriyas HaMegillah. And basically assumes that there's no mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah at night. And the reason for that is because the Gemara says, Hayomim ha'elu nasim nizkar v'nasim. And the nasim refers to, let's say, the mitzvahs of Sudas Purim, of Mishloach Manos. All those are during the day, and the pasuk equates Zechira, which is Kriyas HaMegillah, with Asiyah. And therefore, just like the mitzvah of Seudah and the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos Matos Evyonim is during the day, so too the mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah is by day. In other words, when I read the Megillah by day, I'm Makayim the mitzvah Megillah for the very first time. And whenever I'm Makayim a mitzvah for the very first time, I recite Shechianu. So what, therefore, is the justification for reciting Shechianu at night? And he goes out of his way, the Pnei Yehoshua, to point out that Shechianu at night is not on the Megillah, but rather the Shechianu we recite in the daytime is on the Megillah. It could be that they'll announce in Shul that when you hear the Shechianu on the Megillah at daytime, you should have in mind all the other mitzvahs like Sudas Purim, Mishloach Manos, Matos Evyonim, fine. But the real Machayev of Shechianu by day is Kriyas HaMegillah. It's a brand new mitzvah. So don't ask me why they read the Megillah at night. It's almost like a preparation, like a Vorspeis, let's get a little taste. It's like the night before Purim, let's get a little Megillah action in there. But why make a Shechianu? It's certainly not on the Megillah. That says the Pnei Yehoshua. Okay. Having presented the series of questions, I want to go back to the two psukim and suggest an answer. And you're the jury. Pasuk Yites mentions Simcha, Mishteh, and Yontif. The Gemara says that Isur Malacha lo kiblu alai. I want to be very meticulous about the language of the Gemara. Did the Gemara say A, and here I'm just fooling you, or B, which is the emes? Did it say Yontif lo kiblu alayu? No. It doesn't say that. It says Isur Malacha lo kiblu alayu. Now, in this pasuk Yites, where the Megillah says Yontif, there's no drasha of Yemei Purim v'lo Leilos. Then we fast forward to pasuk Chaf Beis, and there the description of Purim is Yemei Mishteh v'Simcha. And we derive from the word Yemei, says Rava, that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Sudas Purim at night. What I'd like to suggest is that there are two different dimensions to Purim. And the Nafka Mina is going to be the night of Purim. One dimension of Purim is Yontif. Purim was established as a Yontif. That's what Mordechai had in mind, and that's what the people accepted. What's included in Yontif? A whole bunch of things, including an Isur Hesped, an Isur Tainus, a mitzvah of Suda, Shechianu, as we'll soon see, and possibly even Mishloach Manos. The clincher of the list would be Isur Malacha, but that they didn't accept. What we have in front of us in Pasuk Yites is what I call A Chal Shem Yontif, the Itzuma Shal Yom HaPurim is Yontif, with a Heter Malacha. Rabbi Berzon, were you off your raka? Where do we have a Yontif without an Isur Malacha? And the answer is Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed is Yontif. How do I know this? I know this because my Rebbe told us in the name of his grandfather Reb Chaim that Reb Chaim would not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And when they asked Reb Chaim, why don't you wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed? After all, the Ramos says we should wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed because the Isur Malach on Chol HaMoed is only D'Rabbanan. That's why there's so many heterim of when you're and how you're allowed to do malach, 5 different heterim. So Reb Chaim responded. First, they thought that Reb Chaim was just following the midig of Valoj. No. Reb Chaim says, I do it because I believe that Chol HaMoed is a yontif like any other yontif. Chol HaMoed is endowed with the Kedusha Sayom of yontif. There's no Isur Malacha, according to those Rishonim who say the Isur Malacha is only the Rabbanon. The answer is there's a Heter Malacha. In other words, the day itself inherently would generate an Isur Malacha because it's got the Kedusha Sayom. Chol HaMoed has Kedusha Sayom of yontif. But in practice, there's a heter. It's like if you've seen in Shas the phrase huta mechlolo, if you're familiar with that. And huta mechlolo means that really it should be osur, but there was a special matir. But the isur per se remains in place. And therefore, I don't wear tefillin, says Reb Chaim, because it has the Kedush Hayom of Yontif, which is os, and we don't wear the os of tefillin on a day that's endowed with the Kedush Hayom of os. Chol HaMoed doesn't get tefillin. Now, I don't know what you do in Clinton Park on Chol HaMoed. I was once down in Miami, and they have a takana that if you don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, you can't be Ola L'Ducha. You can't be the Shliach Tzibur. You cannot serve as a Shliach Tzibur if you don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. P.S. I took a look around. I would say about 60% of the people in the audience were not wearing tefillin. Maybe that cuts down the possibilities for a Shliach Tzibur. But in any event, what am I trying to point out? When the Rabbanan established Purim, and Mordechai, as the head of the Sanhedrin, would propose and suggest and recommend to the people that they accept the holiday of Purim. What was the holiday of Purim? It was a day of Yontif. And I see that clearly in Pasuk Yutes. The Gemara says, Isur Malacha lo kibulei, that's a special heter. We were matir, it's like Gzeira she'ein hatzibur yochel lamod ba. They were worried about the poor people. If they wouldn't work on Purim, they would starve to death, I don't know what. And therefore they allowed Malacha on Purim. But the day itself is a day of Yontif. And with this, we answer up the question of the Tur Yevon. The Tur Yevon says, wait a second, Yemei Yomim V'lo Leilos? Then there should be a heter hesped v'tainus at night. No, there's no heter. There's an Isur hesped v'tainus at night because the night of Purim is a Yontif. Now let's fast forward to Pasuk Chav Beis. And there the Pasuk says Yemei, and Rava says to exclude Laila. What's he excluding Laila? He's not excluding Laila from the Shem Yontif. He's excluding Laila from the special mitzvos that were added on top of Yontif. Whenever you see something on Purim that doesn't fit into a Yontif mold, you know it's the separate mitzvah, I call it a mitzvah miyuchedes of Purim. On that, the Tanakh says, Yemei v'lo Laila. So Purim emerges under 2 different categories. And the nafkamina is going to be at night. Under one category, Purim emerges as a tzumo shel Yontif. And that includes the night and the day. Because Yontif is always a 24-hour enterprise, including the night. And therefore Chazal always use the phrase with regard to Yontif, Leilo Kiyomo. The night has the same status as the day. It's a 24-hour thing. But if you're asking me about the special mitzvos that are generated by Purim above and beyond Yontif, and we'll enumerate them, those apply only to the day of Purim. So the day of Purim has a double identity. It's a yontif, and it's got mitzvah miyuchedes. The night of Purim only has yontif. It doesn't have any mitzvah miyuchedes. Now let's see if we can answer our questions. The Turieven wants to come to the conclusion that they never accepted an Isa Malach at night. That's rejected. Turieven is making an assumption that we're not going to accept. There's no difference between the night and the day as far as Isa Malacha. It's all mitzalib, it's all generated by Yontif. And if Yontif is going to generate Isa Malacha, it's got to be both at night and by day. Hence the Yerushalmi asks, well, how is he Magia the Megillah? And it wouldn't make any difference whether he's Magia the Megillah and he wrote it at night or during the day. If he did so, it would have to prove that they never accepted the Isa Malacha, because there's no difference between the night and the day as far as the Isa Malacha. Because Leilo Kiyomo, as far as the Shem Yontif is concerned, and Purim has the Shem Yontif. Again, as far as Isur Hespe V'Tainus is concerned, that's endowed or generated by the Shem Yontif, and that applies at night just as it does during the day. When Rava derives from Pasuk Chav Beis, Yemei Purim, that it's Yomim V'Leilos, he's talking about the mitzvah miyuchedes of Purim. The subject and the theme of Pasuk Chav Beis is the mitzvah miyuchedes of Purim, namely Sudas Purim. The Sudas Purim has to be by day. The Megillah reading has to be by day, because it's a separate mitzvah. It's not a Yontif Dika mitzvah, it's a Purim Dika mitzvah. And the special complexion of Purim as a day endowed with its own unique mitzvos emerges by day. And therefore, it makes sense that we would have to eat basar and drink yain, both. Not one or the other. One or the other would be enough at night for a Sudas Yontif, because Purim has the status of Yontif. But during the day, the Rabbanan imposed new obligations on Purim that go beyond that of Yontif, and those new obligations emerge by day. Hence, Adelo Yoda. We have a Sudas Purim that is not to be equated and identified with a Sudas Yontif. It's not a Sudas Yontif. It's a Sudas Purim. And as such, it has special dinim and higher requirements of both yayin and basar, and it has a requirement of adelo yada. The night of Purim is a yontif. It would generate an Isa Malach, except they didn't accept it, so it was a special matir that permitted them to do Malach. It has the Isur Hespe V'Tainus, and now we have the Ravya. Let's go through the Ravya. The Ravya says that on the night of Purim you have to eat a Suda. Mistaber, I understand the logic of the Ravya. The Ravya is arguing that the night of Purim is Yontif. Again, it doesn't have to be a Suda Chashuva. It doesn't have to be a Suda that goes beyond the dimensions of a Sudas Yontif, with Adelo Yoda, with Yayin and Basar. But it's a Sudas Yontif. And I'm even tempted to think, but don't quote me on this, that according to the Rav Yah, if you left out Al Anisim at night, you would not have to repeat Birkas HaMazon, because Al Anisim doesn't fit into a frame of Yontif. Al Anisim fits into the special mitzvah of Purim and the Sudas Purim, which is by day. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to eat a Suda at night. And therefore, when the Bach quotes the Mordechai, who in turn quotes the Rav Yah, he talks about a Suda Chashuva by day. Suda Chashuva means a Suda with Basar and Yayin that goes beyond a classic Suda of Yontif. And as far as the night is concerned, all that the Rav Yah, and you'll read it inside the Bach, all he requires is Laroch Shulchano, set your table at night, and eat pas, make sure that you break bread, and then Yotze, the mitzvah of Sudas Yontif. It's a Sudas Yontif. It's not the Sudas Purim. The Sudas Purim is only by day, because in Pasuk of Beis, which defines the day and excludes the night, and it defines the time framework for a Sudas Purim, it's only during the day. Comes along Rav Yoy, says, but you have to eat a Suda at night, because the Chal Shem Yontif encompasses the full 24 hours of Purim. And therefore, at night, Leilo Kiyomo requires a Suda, but not the Suda of Adal Yoda, not the Suda of Yayin and Basar. That's the Suda of Purim, the special, unique Suda of Purim, the mitzvah of which is limited to day and doesn't apply at night. So I believe that we can now turn around and explain the Pnei Yoshua. Why does the Pnei Yoshua insist that we recite Shechiyonu at night? After all, we're going to recite a second Shechiyonu by day on the new mitzvah of Megillah, because the new mitzvah of Megillah comes under Pasuk Chav Beis, where the Megillah says Yemei Purim, and that's only by day. So the real McCoy Megillah reading is only by day. And therefore it's the first mitzvah of Megillah, and therefore you make a Shechiyanu. But at night, you need another Shechiyanu. Why? Because every night of Yontif, with the emergence of Yom Tov, there's Itzumo Shel Yom, there's a special day. And that special day requires Shechiyanu. So I have two different Shechiyanus. I have a Shechiyanu at night on the Yontif, and a Shechiyanu on the day on the special mitzvah of Megillah reading, which is only by day. And perhaps if this is correct, I can understand the sequence of Mishteh and Simcha, which is inverted in Pasuk Chav Beis. In Pasuk Yutes it says Simcha and then Mishteh, because the Pasuk wants to emphasize that this is a Yontif, and therefore the Pasuk alludes to the right. The word Simcha alludes to the Pasuk V'samachta b'chagecha. In contrast, in Pasuk Chav Beis, which defines the special mitzvahs of Purim, we're going to start with Mishteh. Simcha is going to be secondary, because the Simcha of Purim is not to be identified with the Simcha of Yontif. The Simcha of Yontif is a day of, I almost call it a solemn day, a serious day of V'samachta l'fnei Hashem Elokecha. That Yontif is a day in which there's a unique, close relationship to the Rebbeinu Shalom, to the Shekhinah, and that gives us Simcha. Like Dumya the Kohen Gadol, that he's always besimcha because he's always l'fnei Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash. That's not the Simcha of Purim. The Simcha of Purim is radically different. It's not a Simcha of l'fnei Hashem. It can't be, because we're reaching Ad Lo Yoda. I mean, Ad Lo Yoda and l'fnei Hashem doesn't stim. So again, just to summarize, the sequence of Mishteh and Simcha is going to switch around. In Pasuk Yud Tes, when we're referring to Simcha, referring to Purim as a Yontif, Simcha is going to come first. And I would go even a step further. Simcha has to come first in Pasuk Yud Tes, because we're identifying Purim as a Yontif. But on the contrary, in Pasuk Chav Beis, Mishteh has to come first. And I'll tell you why. Because in Pasuk Chav Beis, when we're addressing the unique mitzvahs of Purim, we have to start with Mishteh. Because Mishteh is going to tell me Yayin. And once I know Yayin, then why does the Tanakh add the word Simcha after you have already Mishteh? The answer is the word Mishteh is now going to add Basar, because Ein Simcha El B'Basar. So we have an answer to the question of the Emek Bracha, who asks, why is it that on Purim we need both elements? And the answer lies in Pasuk Yud Beis, in Pasuk Chav Beis, because Pasuk Chav Beis is addressing the unique mitzvah of Purim. The Suda has to take place by day. The Pasuk says Yemei v'lo laila. And if you ate the Suda at night, you would not be Yotze. And what's unique about this Suda, it's more than just a Simchas Yontif, a Sudas Yontif. Because it starts with the word Mishteh, and then it adds the word Simcha. But both, I don't know if you should be jumping from your seats for this. I expected a 7-piece band and a stand-up applause here. I don't know. I worked very hard on this. Okay, good. Bruce is clapping his hands here from Pinsker. But I want to tell you something else. I had a kasha on this pshat. I was so excited about it that I thought about the pshat, about the chiddush. I thought that all the pieces of the puzzle fit into place. And then I had a kasha. And I realized that there's one piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit into place. And I got very nervous. Because I thought now maybe the whole castle will fall, the sandal will fall into this. In Pasuk Yutes, which, as we said, addresses Purim as a yontif, it says Simcha, Mishtev yontif, and then it says Mishloach Manos Yisraelu, Ribbon Shalom. Mishloach Manos Yisraelu doesn't belong in Pasuk Yutes. Mishloach Manos Yisraelu has nothing to do with yontif. Who sends manos on yontif? It's a Purim halacha. And therefore, according to our structure, it should only apply at night. And yet, this pasuk is referring to the entire day, 24 hours, because Leilo Kiyomo is a yontif. Well, what's Mishlach Manos? So for the first time in my life, I based myself on a Torah Tmima. I never did that before. And if you have, the pages that David was kind enough to share with you, you'll take a look at page 4. The Torah Tmima is not asking our question. He's not aware of the Tzvei Dinim that we tried to present. But he asks a question and gives an answer that I think could help us a lot. His question is, why is it that Matanis Levyonim is omitted in Pasuk Yutes, and it's spelled out only in Pasuk Chav Beis? He doesn't ask, why is it that Mishloach Manos is mentioned in Pasuk Yutes? Because he assumes that there's no difference between Pasuk Yutes and Pasuk Chav Beis, and Mishloach Manos should apply in both. But if the Megillah went out of its way to mention Mishloach Manos in Pasuk Yutes, why omit Matanis Levyonim? And Matanis Levyonim only appears in Pasuk Chav Beis. That's his question. But I saw in his answer something that would answer our question, why Mishloach Manos is mentioned at all in Pasuk Yutes. And he says, based on a Gemara in Beitza Daf Tas Vav Amid Beis, that the Gemara establishes with a pasuk in Ezra, I'll read the pasuk to you, that on a yontif we have to send Mishloach Manos. Did you hear this? Who ever heard of it? Mishloach Manos on yontif. But wait a second. It's a Mishloach Manos to a particular type or category of Re'ehu. Not Re'ehu in the classic sense, but Re'ehu here in this context means an ani, a poor person. Because the Gemara applies the principle that Ezra formulated. And Ezra is talking about a day that's endowed with Kedush Hayom, like Rosh Hashanah, like Regalim, Shlosh Regalim. And he says, Shilchu Manos. Now listen to the next 3 words. Li'ein nachon lo. Means somebody who's lacking. Ki kadosh hayom la'adonenu. And the Gemara derives from that we should send Manos to Aniyim on Yontif. Now, I don't know if it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. I didn't get a chance to research it. But it certainly appears in the Gemara in Beitza Daf Tes Vav. And therefore, according to the Torah Tmima, since already in Pasuk Yutes, which is referring to Purim as a yontif, we have to send Mishloach Manos. And who do we send it to based on the Pasuk in Ezra, the Gemara and Beitza? We send it to Aniyim. There's no need to mention Matanos Levniyim. Later on, the Pasuk Chav Beis will mention everything that has to be done during the day. But it comes out an amazing chiddush that according to this approach, based on the Gemara and Beitza, when it says Matanos, when it says Mishloach Manos Isla Re'eu, and Re'eu means Aniyim, based on the Pasuk in Ezra, then we have a mitzvah that applies on Purim by virtue of the fact that it's Yontif. Because in general, Yontif generates a Chiyuv Mishloach Manos Ish Le'ein Nachon Lo, meaning to a poor person. So if you ask me, are the Mishloach Manos of the night of Purim identical to the Mishloach Manos of the day of Purim, I would say no. The Mishloach Manos of the night of Purim are to Aniyim. The Mishloach Manos of the day of Purim are to Re'eu. And I'm just going to leave you now with one last question. Is it possible that with regard to Tesvav, right, what we call Shushan Purim, there is no Yontif? Because again, we're basing ourselves on Pasuk Yutes, and Pasuk Yutes defines the day as a day of Yontif, which includes the night, and all the obligations and Isurim that apply at night are all based on Yontif, but the Pasuk is referring to Yoshvim B'Area Prazos, and that's referring to those who celebrate Purim on Yudalit. Could it be that on Tesvav, for Shushan Purim Nix, right, the Mukafas Choma, there is no night of Purim at all? It doesn't exist. Because what generates Purim at night? It's the Shem Yontif. But the Shem Yontif maybe was only to address to the present. And the logic behind it is because who is Bisakana? Those Jews living in unwalled cities were in great danger. And they established the 14th as a celebration and a commemoration of the great Hatzol Yeshua from that great danger. The Ran at the beginning of Megillah says the whole institution of Arim HaMukafas Choma is only L'chvoda Shel Eretz Yisrael, because again, it's got to be Mukas Choma from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, when they conquered the land. But be that as it may, it could be that Purim of Tesvav is dedicated exclusively to the mitzvahs hamiyuchados leyom in Pasuk Chav Beis, because those who were in the Ir Hamukefes Choma would not include it in Pasuk Yutes, because the Pasuk explicitly says Hayoshvim B'Orei Prazos. Just food for thought. Okay, let me take this opportunity to wish you a freilich in Purim. Have a wonderful Purim, and come to visit us here in the Holy Land. You'll get an extra day of Purim if you like. And that's where we're going to end it.